Hello, welcome back. My name is Carly Stevens. This is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. And I have the distinct pleasure of talking to Lindsey Duga today. Lindsey is a middle grade and young adult writer with a passion for fantasy, science fiction, and basically any genre that takes you away from the real world. I get that. She wrote her first novel in college when she was getting her bachelor's in mass communication from Louisiana State University. Other than writing and cuddling with her adorable Morky puppy Delphi, Lindsay loves catching up on the latest superhero TV show and practicing yoga. So, welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for having me, Carly.
I'm so glad we got to reconnect and that we're going to talk all about middle grade horror, which is something I never thought I would get into, but lately I've been enjoying more and more. And you are the perfect person to ask all about it. So, before we dive into that topic, how did you get into writing? I know in your bio it talked about when you wrote your first novel, but that's usually not the beginning of the process. So, where did it all begin?
It definitely is not for a lot of writers. It started as a kid, I think, as most of us do. Like you get sucked into the worlds, and you're like, oh man, what if I could create my own? I started writing novels when I was in seventh grade, but it was with a friend. So we would make up these fantastical fantasy kingdoms made of elves for whatever reason. And that was kind of like what got me hooked into writing. Specifically, fantasy is kind of where I started. And then got into college, had to pick a major and get a real adult job, I guess. And I chose mass communication because it was right next to writing, and it kind of allowed me to explore my creativity on the side. Because even though I enjoyed writing and all types of genres, it was just like, no, I want to do fiction, right? So I started doing my first novel, and I was talking to another writer friend in college, and he was like, Linz, why don't you try to get this one published? Because I had written it by myself for the first time since I had been writing with friends up until
Hmm.
like college, basically through high school. And I was like, oh, I mean, I guess that's possible. Like, how do you even become an author? Because this was back in 2012,
Mhm.
right when I guess I could start looking at the internet and Googling things to figure out like how the process of becoming an author even happens. And basically it was kind of just like, I'm going to see how I can take this book. And I wrote it all through college, and I started querying it once I graduated and had a big girl job. And then I basically attempted that. I revised it, I don't know how many times, maybe like 13 times before I finally shelved it. And then my second novel was also a middle grade. So, like, my first novel was a middle grade fantasy, and it was based, well, it was heavily influenced by Percy Jackson. Like, I'm a big Rick Riordan fan, love all of his books and his series and his world. And so it was heavily influenced by that. And then, so middle grade is probably like where my heart is for whatever reason. I just really love middle grade stories and that age
Hmm.
group.
For
And
anybody who
then
doesn't know, what is the kind of target age group for middle grade? We hear a lot about young adults and kids, but not as much about
right,
middle grade.
middle grade is basically 8 to 14 year olds, and you have 8 to 10 to 12. Really, like 8 to 10, you have that sort of lower level middle grade where it's only like 40 to 60,000 words, maybe even less than that. And then you have upper level middle grade. And so upper level middle grade is more like the 12 to 14-year-olds who are just kind of like, they're not quite ready for YA, but they're like 13 and they're in middle school, and they want to escape into crazier adventure stories. And that's where Percy Jackson really hit its stride, because like Harry Potter is definitely a middle grade when it starts. He's
Mhm.
11. But by the time he ends, we grew with the Harry Potter books. So he's, it's a young adult by the time it ends. But Percy Jackson had a whole series that just felt very, very middle grade, very much in that world. And then there's other series like Arusha, which is also a part of it. Um, uh, Levin Thump's books was something that I really liked. So I found middle grade in college, and I was just like, oh, this age group is so much fun to write for. Um, yeah, and so like that has been where my heart is, but I actually debuted with a young adult fantasy that I ended up writing, which was super fun and very commercial and weird. But yeah, that's how I got into writing.
So what is it about not only middle grade, but middle grade horror that attracted you to it? It seems like perhaps an unusual choice. So what was it about that genre that drew you
Actually,
in?
I kind of fell into it weirdly. So I had gotten an agent through my first book, and I had been working on another middle grade because I was desperate to get published for middle grade because again, it's where my heart is.
Yeah.
And it had been a Victorian story. It was like set in the Victorian era where there was this netherworld full of phantoms and ghouls
Mm.
and the concept of it was kind of based off Monsters Inc. And so the whole concept was like they would travel into the human realm to steal talents out of works of art. And then they would bring the talents back, and how, depending on how great of a masterpiece this piece of art was, it would power their city, so their demon realm. And I absolutely loved the story. It's also a brother and sister duo story, and
Mhm.
I had submitted it to several publishers, and it caught Scholastic's eye. Specifically, a particular editor over there just fell in love with it. He's like, I really want this. But then he took it to acquisitions, and they were like, oh, this is a really hard sell. Fantasy is super saturated. But Lindsey seems to have like a really strong ghosty Victorian vibe, and we had this other idea. And so that is how The Haunting came to be. So
Mm.
basically, my editor at Scholastic came back and he was just like, we can't do this book, your original book, but would you be interested in a Victorian ghost story that we could sell at Scholastic book fairs? And I was like, yes.
Who doesn't want to be sold at a Scholastic book fair? It's every person's
I know,
dream.
like everybody's dream, every author's dream specifically. Um, and whenever he said, and it's think of the author like Mary Downing Hahn, and when he said that, I just lost my mind because I read Mary Downing Hahn when I was a kid. Like I read Mary Downing Hahn and
Oh.
then read Wright when I was like 12, 11. And so I read all of these ghost stories that he had already been referencing. And it never occurred to me to try and write one of them myself because I love sci-fi and fantasy so much.
Mhm.
Um, and so I was like, oh my God, I love Mary Downing Hahn. And so I actually went to the library, picked up every single Mary Downing Hahn and Betty Renwright book I could find, refreshed them, like reread them. And then I was just like, I was like, oh yes, I can do this. Let me do this. And so that's how The Haunting came to be. And then since then, I'm just like, yeah, I will keep writing ghost stories. This is fun. I didn't realize how much I really enjoyed it until I started it. So
Yeah, and
that's
it
how.
was oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's how I kind of fell into it by accident,
Mm.
but it worked out so well.
Sounds like it already overlapped really heavily with what you were planning to do with fantasy and all of that.
With that story in particular, I had a vibe going for that book,
Mhm.
and he was really like, he's like, oh, I love this Victorian setting and just the general tone, and the kind of the creepiness that I also wrote into that book without really meaning to. And so he was just like, oh yes, let's just pluck out these elements and put it with just a simple ghost story. Um, and the cover of it, it was actually right when The Haunting of Hill House was coming out.
As
That
a movie?
It's the Netflix show, right? The
Oh,
Haunting of book, and then Netflix put out a show.
oh, I knew about the I mean, I've read the book, knew there was a movie, didn't realize there was a show. Totally missed that one. Whoops.
It's it was coming out, and it's this beautiful like old mansion. And so I remember my editor being like, oh yeah, the cover of The Haunting is very much Haunting of Hill House type of thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. So the timing of it kind of seemed to end up really well, and it did super well at Scholastic fairs because kids love to be scared. They really do. They're like, how can what can I get that's so creepy that will keep me up at night? Because if you think about it, I mean, like, that's Goosebumps, and Goosebumps was crazy with our generation.
It's true, yeah, everybody I knew read Goosebumps. I was too easily scared, which kind of leads me to my next question. So, how do you find that level of spookiness and creepiness? And, I read The Haunting, and it definitely had those spooky vibes without going over the line into something that is, like, too much for that young audience. Are there any, like, unspoken rules or even spoken rules about what you can and can't do, for that age group?
I would say kind of the obvious ones of like there can't be a lot of violence, like you can absolutely have a ghost that was probably died in a terrible way, but we're not really going to talk about how they died in a terrible way.
Hmm.
Um, there's probably not like just a lot of mentions of violence or anything like that. I would say gore is not a big thing with these types of books. You can have some creepiness, like, of course, blood, maybe some bone showing. But it's all about setting the tension and the mood with these stories. And then also kind of creating a very chilly, creepy atmosphere. And that's really where the spookiness comes into play. It's not like the actual content of it, it's just the atmosphere that you're trying to achieve. As well as just like the ghost's appearances and words that could really spook the reader into being like, what did they say and what does that mean, and I'd have to find out. So I think it's more of the atmosphere and the setting and just the general tone to establish that creepiness than it is the fact that you're dealing with like a skeleton or something like that.
Okay, it's the sense of tension. It's anything could happen, anything could jump out. It's like it's kind of a tame haunted house in that way, I guess. Am I
Yeah.
interpreting
uh,
that right?
Yeah, yeah, and a good example of this would be, so my second book with Scholastic called Ghost in the Headlights, which is a Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Legend of Sleepy Hollow retelling, and it's basically like this little girl who lost her foot, instead of a headless horseman, and instead of a horse, it's actually a ghost car that no one is driving. And so I wanted to have my main character kind of be walking along the road and then hear the footsteps behind her, but it's not
Oh, see,
full
that's
foot.
very scary.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not
Yeah.
full footsteps behind her. It's kind of a stomp and then because she's dragging her mangled limb behind her, right? And
Okay,
so
so you can do some pretty creepy stuff. You just can't talk about the gore in
yeah,
detail.
you're not talking about like the foot being ripped off by a car, right? You're just saying like
Mhm.
she doesn't have a foot. So let's create a mood where you're like you can hear it and she's like limping along after her, and then whenever the main character turns, nobody's there. So that's the creepy tone that you're trying to get.
Yeah, very spooky. I I am getting more into spookier things, so my tolerance for all of that has gone up, but that kind of thing would have just scared the pants off me if I were 10. But I guess that's kind of the point. Some people just love that. They love the thrill of it. What I noticed when I read The Haunting was how much it was structured like a mystery, which I guess makes sense. I mean, the idea that there's this ghost in a house is that's not a plot. A plot is, okay, so what? What do we have to figure out? What do we have to do? What, how is it interacting? It's a lot of the other pieces of it. So, as an adult reader, I could figure out the mystery pretty easily. Maybe not every single piece, but it was, certain things were pretty obvious. So how do you since I think most of if I'm not mistaken, most of your creepy stories are mysteries in some way. Is that
Yes, there's always
True.
something that they have to figure out. And usually it has to do with the ghost's unfinished business, right? Like,
Right.
why is the ghost haunting this particular road or this house? Or, like, what's keeping them here?
Hmm.
And then the main character always has to figure out what that secret is or what that local legend is. And so there does have to be a certain element of mystery and kind of like a Scooby-Doo gang where you also have
Mhm.
a best friend who's working with the main character and they kind of do their own little investigation to figure out what's happening. I actually had to do a lot of that in Ghost in the Headlights. And it's tricky because you kind of have to. I'm not really a big mystery writer, but I did have to work in clues. And of course, it helps when you've figured out the ending and you're like, I know what the mystery is. Now I just have to make sure that I insert the clues in pivotal moments,
Right,
combining. Yeah.
that's what my question was leading toward ultimately was how do you seed in those clues, and particularly how do you seed in those clues in a way that is solvable or nearly solvable for your audience without talking down to them, or making it too obvious. Because I remember, especially at that age, if I even got a whiff of, this writer is not taking me seriously, how you can feel that every now and then? Oh man, I couldn't stand it. I wanted to be taken seriously, but I also wanted to be able to figure things out. So how do you find that line?
Luckily, I think of there's a little bit of leniency with these types of books because the readers are going into it just more or less wanting to be scared. And so since that's the main goal of the book, we're not held to a very high standard of like this mystery has to be like super well crafted and there's got to be like red herrings everywhere and I want to be surprised at the end. It's more like no, you give them enough to make sure that the story is entertaining, keeping up the creep factor while
Mhm.
also guiding them along to like the destination that needs to happen. So I would say with with all of my books, I try to establish what I have seen in other authors or other books do something similar. Photographs are really helpful to establish kind of like a link and not sprinkling in smaller cool clues that they can then reference later to be like, okay, this little girl in the blue dress was mentioned in this photograph in chapter 3. And then we see her again next to the ghost in this other chapter and it's like but it's a version of it's a childhood portrait of the older woman that we're talking to, right? So it's being able to introduce something a little earlier on and then calling back to it later to be like, aha, there is that moment where I remember this happened in chapter 2. So it's a little bit of that, I would say, is just placing small hints that then you can draw larger conclusions from later. And I think for the most part, you don't have to worry about talking down so much to the audience because they're in the story with you. It's more about just telling the story and
Mm.
letting them come to their own conclusions. And then also my editor helps me a lot too. Like he's just like, I think we should put something in here. And I'm like, you're probably right. Yeah.
Do you still do as many revisions now as you did at the beginning, or is it just a couple rounds? Have you figured out more of your own process?
Yeah, so actually, with most of my Scholastic books, with the exception of Ghost in the Headlights, because that one was very hard to write, and I didn't really fully anticipate how hard it was going to be because there are scenes that are so similar to one another. It's like this girl walking down this road
Mm,
several different times. So how can I make the same scene interesting?
mm,
Um, but as far as like the revisions, I basically come up with a synopsis and I send it to my editor, and my editor reviews it, makes me tweak a couple things. But then once I get to actual writing, the synopsis is so thorough that I really don't have a lot of editing to do. Now, that's just with my middle grade horror books. If you talk to me about any other genre, middle grade fantasy, young adult sci-fi, whatever I'm doing, I usually have at least 4 different revisions, and some of them are pretty heavy. So but scholastic tends to be, and middle grade horror tends to follow a formula that doesn't make it too difficult for plotting and character development.
So it's not the huge overhauls, it's more like tweaking details, fine-tuning things.
Yeah, it's more
That's
about like how can we make this scene creepier? He always asks me that. He's like, I don't think this scene is scary enough, and I'm just like, okay, let's add some chilly. Like, it's so cold in this room. Why is it so cold? Because it's
yeah,
nice.
yeah, I noticed there were a lot of different ways that you set that creepy Victorian tone in The Haunting, and I really liked that vibe, and sometimes it was just an analogy that you made to something creepy, that the sound reminded her of, or just these little details, and I was in it for the atmosphere, and I definitely got what I wanted. It was a great ride, so I would highly recommend The Haunting, and probably your other books too, but that's the only one that I can personally attest, to just being charming with some spookiness to it.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, there's actually a few parts in The Haunting that I was pretty proud of whenever I was writing. I was just like, oh yeah, this is going to be scary. Darkness and shadows always seem to be a theme in any of
Mm,
my horror books, because like that's so, it is very thematic in terms of you don't know what's in the darkness, you don't know what's in the closet, there, because it's more of a fear of the unknown when you're looking at shadows and stuff. And that's, I really try and play into that in a lot of my books, so you'll see that in a lot of scenes, because I'm just like, oh, how can I make this creepy? Oh yeah, it's dark, there's shadows.
yeah, I mean, if it works.
Yeah.
I was reminded as I was reading it of being younger in some of the books that I read, those old Victorian houses, and it was just a lovely callback. So for anybody who wants to go into middle grade horror, to try their hand, to excel at that genre, are there any other tips that you would give them, as they're starting out?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, kind of go back to the greats, because, and maybe that's just a personal preference, I love Mary Downing Hahn, I love Betty Renwright. Those are my 2 favorite authors. There are more. I think his name is KJ Alexander, but he's another really big horror writer for Scholastic specifically, actually. I'm sorry, guys. No, no, no. um so I would encourage kind of like reading those authors, because they truly know how to set the tone,
Hmm,
um, and kind of achieve those different atmospheres of creepiness, of ghosts, and just sort of like the different plots that they've been able to bring, sort of like you're dealing with ghosts over and over and over again, or at least with me. Now, horror, Goosebumps, look at R.L. Stein and everything that he's done, but I mostly stick to kind of the ghost genre. And so it's really incredible how they're able to make sort of like the same story different over and over
hmm,
and over again. So I do recommend going back to those old authors. The other thing that I would kind of encourage you guys to do is to watch horror movies. Watch ghost stories. See how they can draw, and try not to do the ones with the big jump scares, like what, or maybe do, because it creates an atmosphere of such tension that you're just like, something is going to happen. I like, there is going to be a face in the window or something. So how can I create that? Um, and then also just kind of experiment with writing creepy scenes, even if you don't have a plot in mind yet. Like, even if that
hmm.
book isn't fully formed, see if you can actually come up with like, what if a kid is alone at home for the first time, his parents are out, and he's, popping a pizza in the oven, and all of a sudden here he hears branches banging on the back window. What happens after that? So like small, even flash fiction pieces where you can just, how can I get someone scared? And then maybe that comes into a full book.
Well, that's I appreciate that. I think those are great suggestions. Yeah, I actually haven't read. Can you say those authors one more time? The 2 that were your favorites? I know you've mentioned them a couple of times, but I can put them down below in the
Mary,
notes.
yeah, Mary Downing Hahn. So she actually wrote a book that I was still talking about when I was in college of how scary that book was for me. It was called
Whoa.
Wait Till Helen Comes. It was actually made into a horror movie, if you can believe that.
Whoa.
But Wait Until Helen Comes. She's also written a book called Took, which was really scary. Um, the Ghosts of Something Manor. I forget what that one was. She's written quite a few. And then Betty Renwright. And so Betty Renwright, unfortunately, I don't think I don't know, she might have passed away. But she wrote The Dollhouse Murders, um, Ghosts Beneath Our Feet, um, Alone in the Dark. So she's done quite a few, and she's Dollhouse Murders was so scary. That was actually one that was very much a mystery type ghost story, where this this girl goes to visit her aunt, and they have this beautiful dollhouse set in the attic, and there was a murder that took place in that old house, like it was a generation ago, and the dolls would move to show what happened during the night of the murder.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
right, and you're just like, ooh, like how can I, that's so cool. So Dollhouse is definitely one of my favorites when I was a kid.
Well, thank you so much for the suggestions. I will put those down below. And how can people find you and your work online as well?
Yep. So Google me, guys. I mean, I think that's the easiest way you can say is lindseyduga.com is my website. My Instagram handle is at Linz with a Z Duga. And then find me on Twitter. I'm more active on Instagram. Please DM me. I love talking to other writers and authors and just readers in general. Yeah. And
All
I
right.
also young adult fantasy as well as middle grade. And next, actually, I've got a few out there. Kiss of the Royal was my debut, but I also have a couple paranormal out there, and I think my favorite probably is Roaring. And this is a book that was set in the 1920s. It is a young adult paranormal where there is a singer in a speakeasy who's a siren. And she lures patrons into the bar, and then there's a FBI agent who is a monster hunter, and he's been tasked to bring her in. So it's kind of a forbidden love story, but also like it's when mobsters, what happens with monsters run with mobsters. So I do encourage that book. That's really fun.
I will add that one to my Goodreads immediately. That sounds great. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really enjoyed getting to reconnect. Again, all of those links are down below. Make sure you like this video if you like it, subscribe for more Carly Stevens books, and I'll see you next week.